Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Madeline tugged her scarf tighter around her neck, hoping it would conceal enough of her features to avoid recognition. She'd been on the run for months, carefully navigating her way back to Chicago, the city she once called home. As she made her way through the crowd, memories of her past life as Maddie flooded back. The life she'd left behind, the person she'd been before everything changed. Before the embezzlement, before the murder, before she'd discovered the earth-shattering truth about her identity. Madeline hailed a cab, giving the driver an address a few blocks from her childhood home. She couldn't risk being dropped off directly. The FBI might be watching. As the city passed by outside the window, she felt a lump form in her throat. She was home, but everything had changed. The cab pulled up to the curb, and Madeline paid the fare with some of the last cash she had. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, taking in the familiar neighborhood. The trees lining the street were ablaze with autumn colors, their leaves crunching underfoot as she walked. Her father's funeral was tomorrow. The news of his passing had reached her through a convoluted network of contacts. People who didn't know her whole story, but were willing to pass along information for the right price. She knew attending was a risk, but she couldn't stay away. Not for this. Madeline found a small motel a few streets over from her destination. The neon sign flickered weakly in the gathering dusk, promising vacancy and color TV. She checked in under a false name, paying cash for a single night. The room was small and musty, with faded floral wallpaper and a sagging mattress. Madeline set her bag down and sank onto the bed, her mind racing. She pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Madeline's breath caught in her throat. "Mom," she whispered. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Maddie, is that you?" "It's me, Mom, but it's Madeline now." A pause, then, "Madeline, of course, where are you? Are you safe?" The concern in her mother's voice brought tears to Madeline's eyes. "I'm in Chicago. I heard about Dad." "Oh, sweetheart," her mother's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. I tried to get word to you, but I didn't know how." "It's okay, Mom. I understand." Madeline wiped at her eyes. "I'm here for the funeral. But the FBI. I know. It's a risk, but I have to be there." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, her mother spoke again. "Come to the house tonight, after dark. We need to talk." Madeline agreed, her heart racing at the thought of seeing her mother again after so long. They said their goodbyes, and she hung up, staring at the phone in her hand. As night fell, Madeline slipped out of the motel room, her hair tucked up under a dark baseball cap. She walked the familiar streets, keeping to the shadows, every car that passed making her tense. Her childhood home looked just as she remembered it, the porch light casting a warm glow over the front steps. Madeline hesitated at the gate, memories washing over her. How many times had she run up those steps as a child, skinned knees and muddy shoes, only to be scolded by her father? Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the front door and knocked softly. Moments later, it opened, and she found herself face to face with her mother. "Oh, Madeline," her mother breathed, pulling her into a fierce embrace. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other tightly. When they finally parted, Madeline saw tears in her mother's eyes. "Come in, quickly," her mother said, ushering her inside and locking the door behind them. The house smelled the same, a mixture of lemon furniture polish and the faint scent of her mother's perfume. Madeline followed her mother into the kitchen, where a pot of tea was steeping on the counter. "Sit down, dear. You look exhausted." Her mother busied herself pouring tea into delicate china cups that Madeline remembered from her childhood. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Madeline studied her mother's face. There were more lines around her eyes, more gray in her hair, but her warm brown eyes were the same. "I'm so sorry about Dad," Madeline said softly. Her mother nodded, her hands wrapped around her teacup. It was sudden. A heart attack. He never knew about your transition. Madeline felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry I couldn't be here. You're here now. Her mother reached across the table, taking Madeline's hand. And I'm so glad to see you, to see the real you. Madeline blinked back tears. You knew? Her mother's smile was sad. I've always known, in a way. Even before you did, I think, what do you mean? Her mother took a deep breath. There's something I need to tell you, Madeline. Something I should have told you years ago. Madeline leaned forward, her heart pounding. What is it? When you were very young, before you started school, I used to dress you up as a girl sometimes. The words hit Madeline like a physical blow. She stared at her mother, unable to speak. Your father didn't know. Her mother continued, her voice shaking slightly. It was our secret. You seemed so happy in those moments, so yourself. But as you got older, I stopped. I was afraid of what people would say, what your father would think. Madeline's mind reeled. Fragments of memories surfaced, the feel of soft fabric against her skin, the jingle of bracelets on her wrist, her mother's beaming smile as she twirled in front of a mirror. Why didn't you ever tell me? Madeline whispered. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. I was ashamed. I thought I had done something wrong, that I had somehow confused you, but now I see. I was just letting you be who you truly are. Madeline felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. All the years of confusion, of feeling out of place in her own skin, suddenly it made sense. I'm so sorry, Madeline, her mother said, squeezing her hand. I should have been braver. I should have supported you. Madeline shook her head, overwhelmed. You couldn't have known. I didn't even know myself until recently. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation hanging between them. Tell me everything, her mother said finally. What happened? How did you end up here? Madeline took a deep breath and began to speak. She told her mother about the years of confusion and self-doubt, about discovering her true identity, about the desperation that led her to embezzle money for her transition. And finally, she spoke of the confrontation that ended in violence, forcing her to flee. Her mother listened without judgment, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. When Madeline finished, she stood and came around the table, pulling her daughter into another embrace. Oh, my darling, she murmured. I'm so sorry you had to go through all of that alone. Madeline clung to her mother, feeling like a child again. What am I going to do, Mom? The FBI is looking for me. I can't keep running forever. Her mother pulled back, cupping Madeline's face in her hands. We'll figure it out together. I won't lose you again. As the night wore on, they talked and cried and laughed, making up for lost time. Madeline felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the burden of her secrets finally shared. When dawn began to creep through the kitchen windows, Madeline knew she had to leave. The funeral was in a few hours, and she couldn't risk being seen in daylight. I'll be there, she told her mother as they stood at the back door. I'll stay out of sight, but I'll be there to say goodbye to Dad. Her mother nodded, tears in her eyes. Be careful, and Madeline, I love you, no matter what. Madeline hugged her mother tightly. I love you too, Mom. As she slipped out into the early morning mist, Madeline felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. She wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came next, she would face it with her mother by her side. The cemetery was shrouded in fog as Madeline made her way through the rows of headstones. She kept to the shadows of the trees, her dark clothing helping her blend into the gloom. From her vantage point, she could see the small gathering around her father's grave. Her mother stood at the front, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. A handful of relatives and family friends clustered nearby, their heads bowed as the priest spoke words of comfort and remembrance. Madeline's throat tightened as she watched the ceremony from afar. She hadn't been close to her father in recent years, their relationship strained by unspoken tensions and misunderstandings, but he was still her father, and the finality of his passing hit her hard. As the priest finished speaking, Madeline saw her mother step forward to place a rose on the casket. In that moment, their eyes met across the distance. Her mother gave an almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging Madeline's presence without drawing attention to her. The ceremony concluded, and the mourners began to disperse. Madeline waited patiently, hidden behind a large oak tree as her mother said her goodbyes to the other attendees. Finally, when everyone else had left, her mother made her way towards Madeline's hiding spot. "You came," her mother said softly as Madeline emerged from the shadows. "Of course," Madeline replied, taking her mother's hand. "I had to say goodbye." Together, they approached the grave. Madeline stared down at the freshly turned earth, feeling a complex mix of emotions, grief, regret, and a strange sense of closure. "I wish things could have been different," she murmured. "That he could have known the real me." Her mother squeezed her hand. "He loved you, Madeline, even if he didn't always understand." They stood in silence for a moment, lost in their own thoughts and memories. Finally, Madeline spoke again. "Mom, I can't stay here. It's too dangerous." Her mother nodded, her expression resolute. "I know, but you're not leaving alone this time." Madeline turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I'm coming with you," her mother said firmly. "I've already made arrangements. The house is being put up for sale, and I've liquidated some investments. We'll have enough to start fresh somewhere new." "But your life here, your friends," her mother shook her head. "None of that matters more than you, Madeline. I've already lost too much time with you. I won't lose any more." Tears welled up in Madeline's eyes. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They embraced, holding each other tightly as a light rain began to fall. When they parted, Madeline saw a new determination in her mother's eyes. "So," her mother said, a hint of excitement in her voice, "where shall we go?" Madeline smiled, feeling a surge of hope. "I've always wanted to see the Pacific Northwest. How do you feel about Seattle?" Her mother laughed softly. "I hear it rains a lot, but I'm sure we can handle a little rain." As they walked arm in arm out of the cemetery, Madeline felt as though a new chapter of her life was beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and risks, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. They spent the next few days making hurried preparations. Madeline's mother, Barbara, worked tirelessly to tie up loose ends in Chicago. She sold off furniture, donated clothes, and said tearful goodbyes to confused but supportive friends. All the while, Madeline remained hidden, helping where she could, but always wary of being discovered. On their last night in the city, they sat together in the nearly empty living room, surrounded by boxes and the ghosts of memories. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Madeline asked, watching her mother run her hand along the mantelpiece. "It's not too late to change your mind." Barbara turned to her daughter, her eyes shining with determination. "I've never been more certain of anything, Madeline. This house, this city, they're just places. You're my family. Where you go, I go." Madeline felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't deserve you." "Nonsense," Barbara said firmly, crossing the room to sit beside her daughter. "You deserve happiness, love, and acceptance, and I intend to give you all of that and more." They hugged tightly, both of them fighting back tears. The next morning, before dawn broke over the city, they loaded the last of their belongings into a rented SUV. Madeline, disguised with a blonde wig and oversized sunglasses, took the wheel while her mother settled into the passenger seat. As they drove out of Chicago, the skyline receding in the rearview mirror, Madeline felt a mixture of sadness and exhilaration. She was leaving behind the only home she'd ever known, but she was also leaving behind the pain and confusion of her past. Their journey to Seattle took them across the heartland of America. They drove through endless fields of corn and wheat, past small towns with quaint main streets, and over rolling hills that gave way to majestic mountains. During the long hours on the road, Madeline and her mother talked more openly than they ever had before. Barbara shared stories from Madeline's childhood, filling in gaps in her memory and providing new context for experiences that had always felt confusing. "Do you remember the time you insisted on wearing my pearl necklace to bed?" Barbara asked with a chuckle. "You were about 4, I think. You said it made you feel pretty, like a princess." Madeline smiled, a vague memory surfacing. "I think I do, actually. Didn't I end up breaking it?" "You did," her mother confirmed. "But I wasn't even upset. You looked so happy wearing it, I couldn't bring myself to be mad." As the miles passed, Madeline found herself opening up about her struggles with identity, her fears, and her hopes for the future. Barbara listened with unwavering support, offering comfort and understanding. "I always knew you were special," Barbara said softly as they crossed the border into Idaho. "I just didn't have the words or the courage to help you understand why." Madeline reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "You're helping now. That's what matters." They arrived in Seattle on a typically overcast day, the city's famous skyline shrouded in mist. They had rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, sight unseen, and were relieved to find it clean and cozy. As they unpacked their meager belongings, Madeline felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was a fresh start, a chance to build a new life free from the shadows of her past. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. Barbara found part-time work at a local bookstore, while Madeline, still cautious about being recognized, took on freelance graphic design work she could do from home. They explored their new city together, marveling at the lush green parks, the bustling Pike Place market, and the ever-present view of Mount Rainier in the distance. Slowly but surely, Seattle began to feel like home. One rainy afternoon, as they sat in a cozy cafe overlooking Puget Sound, Barbara reached across the table and took Madeline's hand. "I want you to know how proud I am of you," she said, her eyes shining. "You've been so brave, Madeline, and I'm honored to be on this journey with you." Madeline felt tears prick at her eyes. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mom. You've given up so much for me." Barbara shook her head. "I haven't given up anything. I've gained everything. I have my daughter, my real, true daughter, and that's worth more than any house or job or familiar routine." As they sat there, hands clasped, watching the ferries cross the Sound, Madeline felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The FBI was still looking for her, and there were legal and personal challenges to face. But for the first time in her life, Madeline felt truly seen and accepted for who she was. With her mother by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future might hold. As the weeks turned into months, Madeline and Barbara settled into their new life in Seattle. They found a rhythm, a sense of normalcy that had been missing for so long. But the specter of Madeline's past still loomed, a constant reminder that their peace was fragile. One crisp autumn morning, as they walked through a local farmer's market, Madeline froze. A man in a dark suit was studying a wanted poster on a community bulletin board. Her poster. "Mom," she whispered urgently, tugging on Barbara's sleeve. "We need to go, now!" Barbara followed her daughter's gaze and nodded, understanding immediately. They walked quickly but calmly towards the exit, Madeline's heart pounding in her chest. Once they were safely back in their apartment, Madeline began to pace, running her hands through her hair. "They're closing in. We can't stay here." Barbara watched her daughter with concern. "Where will we go?" Madeline stopped pacing, a determined look in her eyes. "Canada. Vancouver's not far, and it'll be easier to disappear there." They spent the next few days making hasty preparations. Barbara resigned from her job at the bookstore, citing a family emergency. Madeline tied up loose ends with her freelance clients. They packed only what they could carry in backpacks, knowing they needed to travel light. The night before their planned departure, as they sat on the floor of their mostly empty apartment, Barbara took Madeline's hand. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "Running again." Madeline nodded, her expression grim. "I don't have a choice, Mom. If they catch me..." "I know, sweetheart. I wish there was another way." They held each other close, drawing strength from their bond. The next morning, they set out before dawn, taking a series of buses to avoid using their own vehicle. As they approached the Canadian border, Madeline's anxiety grew. She had obtained fake IDs for both of them, but there was always a risk. At the border crossing, Madeline held her breath as the guard examined their documents. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead, and she prayed her nervousness wasn't visible. After what felt like an eternity, the guard handed back their IDs and waved them through. Madeline didn't relax until they were well into Canadian territory. Vancouver welcomed them with open arms, a city as diverse and vibrant as Seattle, but with the added security of being in a different country. They found a small basement apartment in a quiet neighborhood and once again began the process of rebuilding their lives. Weeks passed, and slowly, Madeline began to let her guard down. She started taking walks in the nearby park, enjoying the crisp Canadian air and the friendly smiles of her new neighbors. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Barbara turned to her daughter. "Madeline," she said softly, "I want you to know that I don't regret any of this. Following you, leaving everything behind, it's been the most meaningful thing I've ever done." Madeline felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Even with all the danger, the uncertainty?" Barbara nodded, taking her daughter's hand. "Even with all of that, because I get to see you living as your true self? That's worth everything to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. Finally, Madeline spoke. "I've been thinking, Mom, maybe it's time to stop running." Barbara looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" Madeline took a deep breath. "I want to turn myself in, face the consequences of what I've done. It's the only way we'll ever truly be free." "But the charges against you..." "I know," Madeline interrupted. "But I can't keep living like this, always looking over my shoulder, and you deserve better than a life on the run." Barbara's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Madeline, are you sure?" Madeline nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm. "I am. It won't be easy, but I have to believe that the truth will count for something. And I'll have you by my side, right?" "Always," Barbara said firmly, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. The next morning, they made their way to the U.S. consulate in Vancouver. Madeline's heart was pounding, but she felt a sense of resolve. As they approached the building, she turned to her mother one last time. "No matter what happens," she said, "know that I love you, Mom. And I'm grateful for everything you've done for me." Barbara squeezed her hand. "I love you too, Madeline. We'll get through this together." Taking a deep breath, Madeline pushed open the door to the consulate. Whatever came next, she would face it with courage and with the unwavering support of the one person who had always seen her for who she truly was. As they stepped into the consulate, Madeline felt a strange mix of fear and relief wash over her. The receptionist looked up, her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" she asked. Madeline took a deep breath. "Yes, my name is Madeline Thompson. I need to turn myself in to the authorities." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I see. Please have a seat. I'll need to contact the appropriate officials." Madeline and Barbara sat in the waiting area, hands clasped tightly together. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as they waited, the quiet hum of the air conditioning the only sound in the room. After what felt like hours, 2 men in suits entered the consulate. They approached Madeline and Barbara, their expressions grave. "Miss Thompson?" one of them asked. Madeline stood, her legs shaky. Yes, that's me. I'm Agent Daniels, and this is Agent Roberts. We're with the FBI. We've been looking for you for a long time. Madeline nodded, her throat tight. I know. I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions. The agents exchanged a look. We appreciate your cooperation, Agent Daniels said. But I'm afraid you'll need to come with us. We have to detain you pending extradition to the United States. Barbara stood up, her voice shaking. I'm her mother. Can I come with her? Agent Roberts shook his head. I'm sorry, ma'am, that won't be possible at this time. But we'll make sure you're kept informed of the process. Madeline turned to her mother, tears streaming down her face. It's okay, Mom. This is what we knew would happen. I'll be all right. They embraced tightly, both of them crying now. I love you, Madeline, Barbara whispered. Stay strong. I'll do everything I can to help you. As the agents gently led Madeline away, she looked back at her mother one last time. Despite the fear and uncertainty of what lay ahead, she felt a sense of peace. She was finally facing her past, and she knew that no matter what happened, she had her mother's love and support. The legal process that followed was long and complex. Madeline was extradited back to the United States, where she faced charges of embezzlement and manslaughter. Throughout it all, Barbara remained her staunchest supporter, visiting as often as possible and working tirelessly with lawyers to build Madeline's defense. During the trial, Madeline's story came to light. Her struggle with her identity, the desperation that led to her crimes, and her journey of self-discovery. While it didn't excuse her actions, it helped to contextualize them. In the end, Madeline was found guilty, but the judge showed leniency in sentencing, taking into account her voluntary surrender and the unique circumstances of her case. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. As Madeline was led out of the courtroom, she caught her mother's eye. Barbara gave her a small, encouraging smile, mouthing the words, I love you. Prison life was challenging, but Madeline found strength she didn't know she had. She used her time to further her education, taking college courses and learning new skills. She also became an advocate for transgender rights within the prison system, working to improve conditions and understanding for other trans inmates. Barbara visited every week without fail, bringing news from the outside world and unwavering support. Their bond grew even stronger through the adversity they faced. 3 years passed, and Madeline was granted parole. As she stepped out of the prison gates, Barbara was there waiting for her, arms open wide. Welcome home, sweetheart, Barbara said, enveloping her daughter in a tight embrace. Madeline hugged her back, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. Thank you for everything, Mom. I couldn't have made it through without you. As they drove away from the prison, Madeline felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would still be challenging, rebuilding her life, dealing with the stigma of her past, but she knew she could face anything with her mother by her side. So, Barbara asked as they merged onto the highway, where to now? Madeline smiled, looking out at the open road ahead. Anywhere, as long as we're together, I'm home. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.